Hi Year 12, welcome to your first proper lesson on the Crusades for your Paper 1 component of the Edexcel History A level. Today we're going to be starting our chronological study of the First Crusade. This is going to take probably about 4 lessons, maybe 5, depending on whether or not we need to just stop and take stock. And it's one of the 4 different topics that we'll look at. So if you want to get this down as your heading, it's what occurred in the Near East which led to the launch of the First Crusade. We're going to try and outline the events between the 7th and the 11th centuries AD and try and think about how these events led to the call for help from the Eastern Christian Church to the Western Christian Church. And I'm going to try and hopefully just give you a bit of background today. There's lots of new terminology, new words, so if there's anything that you're a bit unsure about, please do email. We'll begin to judge the effectiveness of this argument in the wider inquiry question, but on Monday's lesson there will be the second part to this. So this is really part 1 of 2 of the overall question. I've given you a booklet as well, which is just 3 pages long, just so that you can use these as dividers for your new folders. And I would suggest getting a new folder now. Don't want to use the same one as the Anglo-Norman and Anglo-Saxon topic. So what we're going to be looking at is this first chronological topic, which is the First Crusade. Remember that the paper 1 is actually taught thematically, and the questions are predominantly thematic, but what we're going to be doing first is going through everything chronologically so you've got that overview. So we'll look at the First Crusade, then we'll look at the establishment and defence of Outremer, then the Second Crusade, and finally the Third Crusade. The topics that we're looking at within the First Crusade really boil down to 3 key inquiry questions. So we're going to be looking at why did the Pope launch the First Crusade, what motivated people to join and participate in this First Crusade, and why did the First Crusade succeed. I would recommend bookmarking that particular link that is in that booklet, which is called the Fordham Internet Medieval Sourcebook. It's got an insane amount of primary sources to do with the Crusades, not just the First Crusade, but all of them. And particularly if this is something that you're choosing to do for your coursework, it's a definite go-to. You have to be using that website. So make sure that you bookmark that as well. So before we start to look more closely at the reasons for the causes of the First Crusade, we need to start at the moment that the Crusade was launched. And it's worth saying that the word Crusade is not really used up until, I think it's the 13th century. So it's not used in the terminology of when actually the First Crusade was launched. But in November 1095, Pope Urban II was gathered. He was in France. He was in Clermont, and he addressed first members of the clergy, but then wider, he mentioned this to people within the city, and he called for Christians to take back the Holy Lands. And if you've done your map activity, you'll know a little bit about what I mean by Holy Lands. He asked them to take the Holy Lands back from pagans and heathens, but the main group are this group called the Seljuk Turk forces. Now, there are 5 accounts of what he said. They all differ slightly. They've all got a slightly different message. But what we need to do is we need to understand from those particular 5 sources why he made that call. And it's not straightforward as to say this is just one particular reason why he decided to do this. There are a multitude of different reasons behind Pope Urban II's decision. And this is an important question in the wider context of looking at history, because we're looking at somebody making a call to arms. If we're looking at George W. Bush making a call to arms against Afghanistan, against Iraq and Saddam Hussein, if we're looking at recent activities as well, calls for Putin to make decisions to go into the Ukraine, the call for arms in a war is a massive decision, and it's one that we do have to break down, because we need to judge whether or not they were essentially fighting a cause that was realistic, but also feasible, and also something that was worthwhile. So with the Crusades, we can generally break it down into 6 different reasons. So those are the 6 reasons which you've got on the screen there. The desire to free Jerusalem, so the religious importance of these lands, the political ambitions of Pope Urban II, this theory called just war, so the theory that war could be justified, the threats to something called the Byzantine Empire, and we'll talk about that today, political infighting in Europe in the 11th century, which you know a lot about already. You know about the situation with Normandy and with England, and a call to arms, or a call for help really, from an emperor called Alexius I. or Alexius I. Now, these 6 different arguments can also be further divided into 2 different groups. And these 2 different groups are roughly what we call schools of thought. Now, historians don't like this. Historians don't like being pigeonholed and told that they're part of a specific school of thought. But a school of thought is essentially an interpretation that historians might collectively share. And with the causes of the First Crusade, we can generally divide it into 2. So the first is this idea that the Crusade was caused by political decisions within the Western Church. So situation in Europe, what Pope Urban II wanted to do for Europe led to him calling this First Crusade. And that school of thought is shared by some historians, including the man at the top, who's Thomas Masneck. And he's not the only historian to really hold this interpretation or judgment. The second school of thought is that actually the reasons for the First Crusade were mainly born from the East, from the lands in which the Crusaders eventually went to. So the situation that was going on in the Holy Lands, the situation particularly in Jerusalem, and the situation with an empire called the Byzantine Empire led to the First Crusade being called. So historians like Peter Frankopan, in his book The First Crusade, The Call from the East, which I would recommend, very good book. Not to say that Crusade and Peace isn't a good book as well, but it's a seminal work when you're looking at the First Crusade. That's the overall school of thought, and it's that second school of thought that we're going to be looking at in today's lesson. And we can generally take those 3 highlighted causes and say that they make up this generic school of thought. So this is the one that we need to focus in on today, and this is the one that I want you to make some notes on based on this lecture style lesson. And I'd like you to do this in a mind map format, and I'll show you what that is in a second. But this is about the decision that Pope Urban II makes was prompted by matters that pertain to the East, and that in order to secure Jerusalem and understanding why Jerusalem is so important, and in order to preserve the Byzantine Empire, Pope Urban II made this particular decision. So this Eastern interpretation, this Eastern school of thought, is what I want you to make notes on. And there are 3 sub causes which you've looked at. So on the mind map which you've been given, or you can do it in your own style. You don't have to necessarily use the document I've given you. You don't have to print that off. You can copy it out if you like. I'd like you to make notes on Jerusalem, the threats to Byzantium, and Alexius I's plea. And for each of those particular subheadings, you can make notes from that, so that hopefully you should have quite a large mind map at the very end of this. But what I do want you to do is I want you to be able to make connections between these particular subheadings. So for example, if you see something that links Jerusalem to the threats to Byzantium, draw that link together. Likewise, what I'll try and do is not necessarily say that this is the best argument. I'll try and give you some counter arguments, some counter evidence to maybe undermine this interpretation. So let's start off with Jerusalem itself, and if you do get a chance, you can find quite good summaries of this. There's an amazing book by Simon Sebag Montefiore, which is a biography of the city of Jerusalem. I would recommend that you find a summary of that, or if you're interested in Arian philosophy, and I know that some of you study Arian philosophy, that it would be a worthwhile book to read. Now, as a bit of a caveat before I go through the city of Jerusalem, I just want to say that I'm not going to talk about the historical importance of Jerusalem for Jews and for the Judaism religion. It is incredibly important for Judaism, Jerusalem. It's probably one of the most contentious issues in the world today, looking at the state of Israel and the state of Palestine, how Muslims and how Jews view this particular city. But for the purposes of this lesson, I'm not going to go into details about the significance of Jerusalem for Jews. If you are interested, there's plenty of information online, but it's not relevant to our particular question, and that's why I'm missing it out. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about the importance of Jerusalem for Christians. And really it boils down to this major point that the last days of Jesus Christ were in Jerusalem. And a number of particular sites within Jerusalem holds significance for people who are Christians. And there are two major places. There's Calvary, which is the hill where Jesus was crucified, and there's the Holy Sepulchre, which is the cave tomb where Christ was resurrected. Now you can see on the diagram on the right of the bottom right of the screen that over time these particular two locations, which are relatively close together, changed. And the reason why they changed is because as the Christian faith became larger and it became more widely accepted, more Christians decided to travel to Jerusalem to see what this situation was. And through demolitions in the 4th century, we actually aren't able to see the specific tomb and the specific hill in the exact same way that it would have been around the 1st century AD. So by the 4th century AD, Christians began to travel to these sites to try and bring them closer to God, and we call that a pilgrimage. So Christians were making pilgrimages from all over Europe. It was largely sparked by Empress Helena of the Byzantine Empire. We'll mention what the Byzantine Empire is later. She was the first person to really push this message of pilgrimage, and it started to become more widely known across Europe, that if people went to Jerusalem, this could be a way of making up for past sins. So it would be called penance. So if they had the money and they had the will, they could go and experience the places that Jesus experienced, and that would hopefully give them a clear idea of what kind of Christian they were and bring them closer to God. And this became an idea that spread throughout the areas in which Jesus of Nazareth and his disciples had spent much of their lives. So lots of different pilgrimage sites started to crop up around Jerusalem and within Jerusalem itself. So for example, Bethlehem. And really pilgrimage became an important part of Christian culture from the 4th century up until the 11th century, and it still is today, obviously. But to give you a bit of context, by the 1060s, 7,000 German pilgrims set off to Jerusalem. That's a long voyage. It's not a quick journey. Nowadays it's 4 hours flight to Jerusalem, or a little bit more. At that particular time, this is going to take a year of their lives, minimum. So this is a significant part of Christian culture, and pilgrimage is something that is expected if you have the money. The other Abrahamic religion that we haven't mentioned so far is Islam, and Islam is a religion that is born about much later than Christianity and Judaism, but Jerusalem itself also holds significance for Muslims. So the Prophet Muhammad visited Jerusalem in 61 as part of his night journey, and if you are interested in that, that's a really important moment that Muslims celebrate, where Muhammad was, and I'm not 100% sure if I've got this right, but travelled from Mecca and Medina to Jerusalem and prayed with people who were in Jerusalem at that time. And that mosque, or that place where he had those prayers, was commissioned and was built afterwards. It's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it was designated as a place of pilgrimage by the Prophet Muhammad in his lifetime. And actually in the Islamic faith, it's the third holiest site that Muslims can visit. And this area around the Al-Aqsa Mosque became known as Temple Mount, and it's one of the most sacred sites. It doesn't just include the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it includes the Dome of the Rock, which you can see below you as well. So it's important to note that Jerusalem is important for Jews, Christians and Muslims. And surprisingly, from about the 7th century to the 11th century, we see a relative period of peace between Christians, Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem. It's important for all of them because they're all Abrahamic religions. There's crossover, and as a consequence, they actually understand that the various points of the city are religiously significant to them, and therefore they need to be able to visit them as part of their own pilgrimages. So since 638, Muslim caliphates, so their Muslim empires, had held Jerusalem, but the first major Muslim caliph, Omar, who took over the city in 638, they understood this significance, and they understood as well that they could financially gain from this, and they also understood that it would be more beneficial to have Jerusalem as a peaceful settlement. So when Omar took over the city in 638, he ordered the city to be cleaned, rebuilt, and he allowed members of the three Abrahamic religions to have safe passage to the city and to have safe passage within the city as well. Now, in the case of Jews and Christians, what they had to do, because this was still part of, under the rulership of a Muslim caliph, was that they had to pay a special tax, which was called a jizya. They had to wear separate clothing styles. They couldn't ride horses. They weren't allowed to try and convert Muslims to their own faith, but they were allowed to be in the city, and that actually meant that, from about the 7th century up until probably the latter half of the 10th century, that the Muslims actually were the minority in Jerusalem, and as a consequence, lots of the cultures became quite Christianized, if that's a word, within Jerusalem itself. Pilgrims could continue to come to Jerusalem, and really we have a golden age of tolerance that lasted for 3 centuries. But this does change in 1009. So after about 350 years of peace between the religions, there was a caliph called Hakim, and there's lots of evidence about Hakim, but the general suggestion is that he was mentally deranged. Don't know whether that's chroniclers afterwards trying to besmirch his name, but he was certainly anti-Christian, and he ordered the removal of Christians in Jerusalem. In particular, he decided that he would destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So that's the church that was built up around these 2 important sites of where Christ was resurrected and Christ was crucified. He also ordered that many Christians were killed. Now, what you then think is, well, that's the 11th century. We're now seeing a disintegration of relations between Christians and Muslims. That's going to lead to tension that could potentially lead to the call for crusade. However, this was an isolated event. It shocked Christian groups in Western Europe. They expressed their outrage, but they didn't do anything. But the interesting thing is that the caliphs that followed Hakim tried to actually restore these relations. They got architects from Western Europe and Eastern Europe, particularly the Byzantine Empire, so Christians, to try and rebuild the Holy Sepulchre Church, which they did. They tried to restore relations, and they were very diplomatic about this. So we can say that Jerusalem, even really up until just before the period of the call for crusade, was relatively stable and relatively tolerant between the 3 different religions. Now, this argument that Pope Urban II wanted to preserve in Jerusalem as a Christian city and to rid it of other religions is supported by some of the texts that were given of the speech in 1095 that he makes for the call to crusade, and I've put on the screen there one account. So this is Baudry of Dole's account of Pope Urban II's speech, which was written just after 1095. I've tried to highlight a number of different points, but I'd recommend just pausing the video and having a read through and just seeing some of the language that's being used here. You can see that there's a common theme of pollution has been reduced to the pollution of paganism. So paganism, not a religion of Christianity. Non-believers see this in common with the Christians and are not turned their ways. They are indeed afraid, but they are not converted to the faith, nor is it to be wondered at, for a blindness of mind rules over them. So there's an argument to suggest that the Pope wants Jerusalem to be a Christian stronghold because of the significance to Christianity alone. But not all of the 5 records of Pope Urban in his speech mention this particular message. Only 3 of them do. And remember, there's been a 350-year period of tolerance, and actually probably a bit more than that as well in the 11th century. So we can't alone say that the Pope wanted Jerusalem just in the hands of Christians, because there has been a golden age of tolerance since Islam has been founded as a religion. The second argument that makes up this overall school of thought is about the threats to something called Byzantium. Now, the Byzantium Empire was an empire that remained after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, which is situated obviously around modern-day Italy and around its capital of Rome, disintegrates in the first few centuries after in AD. So there isn't a specific date where you can say that there's the collapse of the Roman Empire. It happens sporadically. But what happens is that the eastern half of the Roman Empire is preserved, and it's centered around a city called Constantinople, also known in present day as Istanbul. Now, for the purposes of what we're going to look at, we're going to call it by its third name. So the same place is called Constantinople, Istanbul. It's also called Byzantine, or Byzantine. These two words make up the empire that follows, that's centered around this area, and we call that the Byzantine Empire or the Byzantium Empire. And really it's an Eastern Roman Empire. By the 6th century AD, it's still controlling a large amount of areas. So it's controlling areas in Spain and modern day Portugal, around the Algarve region. It controls the Holy Lands around Jerusalem. It controls Northern Africa, modern day Turkey, modern day Greece, Croatia, Italy. It's an expansive empire and is incredibly powerful. But the Byzantine Empire is too spread out and it has too many threats. And with the emergence, particularly in the 7th century, of Islamic warlords and Islamic caliphs, the Byzantium Empire starts to shrink. So you can see that by 650 AD, the situation is completely different. The Byzantium Empire is mainly still centered around Constantinople or Byzantine, but it's mainly confined to the coasts, and the territories that they hold are really spread out. And this continues to happen over the next few centuries, that the Byzantine Empire starts to contract. It starts to become smaller and smaller. And one of the reasons for this, as we've mentioned already, is the expansion of Islam in the 7th century. Now, the expansion of Islamic leadership is sometimes known as caliphates, and we call this particular period the growth of the caliphates. Now, we have 3 successive caliphates, so these are different rulers under each, that are leading these caliphates, and they spread through the 7th century and into the 8th century. So under Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, Arabia is essentially unified under one caliphate. That's expanded under the Rashidun Caliphate to North Africa, to present-day Iraq, present-day Iran, Syria, this region here, which is known as Anatolia. Actually, this area here, which is modern-day Turkey or Anatolia, they start to conquer areas of that. And under the Umayyad Caliphate, going into the 8th century, that spreads even further all across North Africa, into Spain, even into parts of southern France. So if you've ever been on holiday to Spain, you'll notice this Moorish influence, this influence of the Islamic faith, and that comes from the 8th century. And this is a threat to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is shrinking as the caliphates are expanding. And the Abbasid Caliphate, which is round about 850, is the caliphate that lasts all the way up until, I think it's the 13th century. And these are successive rulers from the same family that continue to try and take territories in North Africa and in Europe and in the Middle East. The Abbasid Caliphate is strong, and it's an empire almost under the leadership of the Abbasids. But in the 10th century and in the 11th century, this slightly changes, and this is a real threat to the Byzantine Empire. It's probably the biggest threat that they faced. So a certain tribe known as the Seljuk Turks converted to Islam in the 10th century, and they're from this particular area here which is like modern day Armenia and Azerbaijan. And what they do is they start to rapidly become the dominant force in the Abbasid Caliphate, so much so that they actually are the rulers of this entire caliphate. But rather than just centering on one particular area and having a capital city, they like to expand their empire. They like to live a nomadic lifestyle, which means that they're moving and they're fighting. So the caliphate starts to destabilize, and they start to have unlawful acts, particularly in this region called Anatolia, modern day Turkey, also known as Asia Minor. That's been traditionally the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. And in 1064, for example, one Seljuk Turk group attacked and killed 5,000 Christian pilgrims. So where these pilgrims were going to Jerusalem, it was now a dangerous journey. The Seljuk Turks had made it a dangerous journey, and it wasn't safe for them to have that passage anymore. Now, the Byzantine Empire is the most significant empire at this particular time. You know, they can defeat the Seljuk Turks. Everyone's in agreement with that point. Until 1071, when there's a battle at Manzikert, and you can see it in the map here. You can see 1071 is identified. The Seljuk Turks, against the odds, against everyone's expectations, defeat the Byzantine Empire, and it's a crushing defeat for the prestige of the Byzantines. Now they are seen as no longer the dominant force in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. They're now a group that can be attacked. And the Seljuk Turks know this. They turn their attention to Syria, turn their attention to many of the Byzantine ports, and they start to attack them and take them over. So that route for pilgrims is no longer safe. It's under constant threat. And we know that this is something that's in Pope Urban II's mind. Again, when we look at accounts of the sermon from 1095. So this is Fulcher of Chartres' account of Pope Urban II's speech. And again, I'd recommend just pausing the video, having a read through, and seeing whether there's evidence there of this danger of the Seljuk Turks to this Byzantine Empire. So you can see, for as most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania, the Greek Empire, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean, the Hellespont. The Hellespont is Byzantine, which is called the Arm of St. George. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. And we need to destroy that vile race from the land of our friends. So the friends being the Byzantine Empire. So clearly there's evidence there that Pope Urban II was thinking that there was a threat to the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuk Turks were a threat to Christianity. It was important to remove them. However, caliphates had expanded throughout time, had come much closer to Eastern Europe. They weren't necessarily the same, they weren't the religion of Christianity. So why didn't invasion take place earlier? Why didn't it take place in 1009 when the Caliph Hakim attacked Jerusalem? Why didn't it take place in 1071 when the Byzantine Empire was really hurt? So why in 1095? It can't just be as simplistic as saying the Byzantine Empire was under threat. And actually, we can pin it down to 1095 for one reason. It takes place in 1095 because the Byzantine Emperor in 1095 makes a plea to Pope Urban II. He specifically calls for help. And this particular emperor is called Alexius I, or Alexius Comnenus. He came to the throne in 1081 after the Byzantine Empire was becoming weaker and weaker and had been defeated by the Seljuk Turks in a number of battles. He wasn't part of the dynasty. He had taken the throne by force. He was a young man, and he was a general. And he faced threats on 3 different fronts. So he faced a threat from the Seljuk Turks from the south, which we already know about. He faced a threat from pagans, so tribesmen from the Balkan north. These are groups like the barbarians. And he faces a threat from the Normans. These aren't the same Normans that are in England at this time. These are like cousin equivalents. These are southern Italian Normans, and they're attacking the Byzantine Empire from the west. Now, from 1081, what he does is he uses mercenaries. He has effective alliances with groups like the Venetians, so from Venice. He makes clever tactical decisions, he has plenty of luck, but he successfully defeats both the northern pagans and the Normans by really 1091. So in a 10-year period, he's successfully defeated two of the major threats, and only the Seljuk Turks remain. And what he actually does to try and sort this problem with the Seljuk Turks is he decides to open up diplomacy. So he opens up talks with the Seljuk Turk leader, who is Malik Shah, and it actually looks like that there might be a little bit of stability and a little bit of peace between the two. But unfortunately, Malik Shah dies in 1092, and by 1095, most of the important coastal towns were in the hands of Seljuk lords, and actually important settlements like Nicaea, which is only 60 miles from Byzantine, have been taken by the Seljuk lords. So Alexius I has a decision to make. So through either desperation or confidence that he could wipe out the Seljuk Turks completely, because there is an argument to say that he was in a much more stable position, Alexius sends a messenger, or sends a group of messengers, to meet with Pope Urban II, the leader of the Western Church. Now, the church at this particular point was divided in Europe. There was the Eastern Church, which was centered around Byzantine, and then there was the Western Church, which is centered in Rome. So Urban II and is the Western Pope. Alexius I is going to ask for help from him. Now, it's interesting that he's asked for help from a religious leader. Previously, in 1090, Alexius called for help from the Count of Flanders, Robert I, who gave him some troops. I think it was 500 troops. It's not the first time that Alexius has called for help from the West. You know, he's used Vikings, he's used Normans, he's used plenty of people as mercenaries. But this is the first time that he's called for help from a religious leader. So clearly he sees that this man holds importance and significance and perhaps can get wider support across Europe. Now, this meeting that takes place between these envoys and Urban II isn't completely clear, but we do have a chronicler who wrote just after this, who may or may not have been present. And this meeting is called the Council of Piacenza. It takes place in March of 1095, and that's only 8 months before Pope Urban II's call for a crusade. So clearly it had an impact. And this is the plea that Alexius I made to Urban II. This is the translation of the account for what take place. So we don't have the exact wording of Alexius I, but it is paraphrased. So likewise, a legation came to this synod from the Byzantine emperor, so that's Alexius, who humbly implored the Lord Pope, that's Pope Urban II, and all the faithful of Christ that they offer help to him against the pagans for the defence of the Holy Church, which they had already had almost annihilated in these parts, occupying those regions up to the walls of the city of Byzantine. So he's making his claim that there's a threat to the Byzantine Empire. You know, notice here that it says for the defence of the Holy Church. It doesn't necessarily clearly say Jerusalem there. The Lord Pope induced many men to offer this help, so that they promised indeed by oath that they will journey there with God's help, and to the best of their ability will provide help to the same emperor. So that's the only real record that we have of Alexius I's plea, but clearly it has an impact. March 1095, Urban II gets this plea. By November, he's called for a crusade. But the situation in the East wasn't groundbreaking in 1095. You know, we know that this has been going on for a number of decades, and Pope Gregory VII, for example, had heard similar issues in 1074, and he'd even called for a crusade then, but he didn't spread the message very widely. So we can't necessarily say that it's just down to Alexius I's plea. You can go on the Fordham Internet Medieval Sourcebook and have a look at that particular link. Now, that's what I'd like you to kind of get from most of the lesson in terms of this lecture. You can make notes on that mind map in the same format. You can make notes in a different way, but I'd like you to think about these questions. Why would Urban, a Western Pope, be enticed by Alexius I's plea? That's the first one. The second question is difficult because it might be better after you've done part two. If you were to rank the three arguments within this Eastern school of thought, how much strength would you actually give to each one? And what you can actually do to help you with that is go onto the Internet Medieval Sourcebook, start to look through the full extracts of Pope Urban II's speeches, the 5 different accounts of them, and see if there's more evidence to support any of those 3 particular points. This is very interpretation based, this particular course, so it's important that you engage with the different arguments and see whether or not there's many strengths. There's a lot of new information from this, so if there's anything that you're a bit unsure about, just send me an email. Thanks very much for listening.